Welcome back to another episode of Rock Boys Football. Mario Cristobal, the Miami Hurricanes, working their way through that first week of spring practice. And now the players go on spring break. They're going to come back next week. The pads are going to come on. And I think for, a lack of better terms, it's going to get a little bit more real for Miami during spring. As you go into the spring scrimmages and as you obviously go into the spring game and the practices become a little bit more physical and live, you're going to get a really good feel for who really has separated going into the 2025 year. I think one of the biggest storylines for me is that, hey, these early enrollee freshmen, the guys like Hayden Lowe, Kellen Wiley, a guy like Malachi Tony, that is generating a ton of buzz on the offensive side of the football. It's one thing to look the part when you're in shorts and a t-shirt. It's going to be a whole nother thing, especially when it comes to freshmen who got to show that they are physically capable enough to play at the collegiate level. We're going to find out a lot more about this football team going into the next couple of weeks. But at the same time, I don't want to underplay the early reports that we have gotten out from Miami during that first week of spring ball. Because if you're a Miami Hurricane fan, we had a couple of really big question marks, really big storylines heading into spring practice. I think most of them had to do with the defensive side of the football, specifically in the secondary. When it comes to that, it sounds like there's a lot of optimism that Miami really hit with their transfer portal additions in the secondary. And I don't think it's all that crazy to be sitting here right now and saying what was probably the biggest not probably, which is definitely the biggest weakness for this Miami team in the 2024 year, a secondary that outside of OJ Frederick just really couldn't play. Going into 2025, it doesn't sound all that crazy that we're talking about maybe this being the strength of this football team heading into the 2025 year. And then I think that the second big question mark is, hey, do we have enough around Carson Beck in terms of playmakers? Now, at the running back position, that run game as a whole, we feel really good about it, right? Dominant offensive line, two really good running backs, and it sounds like Jordan Lyle. We're talking about early spring predictions. One of my predictions might be Jordan Lyle goes for 1,000 yards, and it'll be difficult because you have a guy like Mark Fletcher who is going to get a lot of work as well. Everything you're hearing about Jordan Lyle is just kind of feeding and kind of fueling the fire that this kid might be one of the best running backs in the country in the 2025 year, and he's going to be running behind one of the best offensive lines that we see in 2025. It's not a knock on Mark Fletcher. It's just about Jordan Lyle maybe just being a different kind of cat. And what excites me the most about Jordan Lyle is, like, he was awesome as a true freshman, as a guy that did not come in for winter workouts and spring practice last year as a freshman, came in the summer, balled out during fall camp, and with a loaded running back room of Damian Martinez and Mark Fletcher, and even a guy like a Jay Allen, who I think was pretty dang good running back, Jordan Lyle became hard to keep off the field for Miami. What does it look like going into year two with a full winter workout period, with a full spring practice for the first time for Jordan Lyle? You really might see him really come on. But I think the second storyline is these young wide receivers seem to be good enough for Miami going into 2025. And the next couple of weeks are going to be huge from a kind of an evaluation standpoint for Miami. Saying, hey, we really like what we've seen so far from guys like Elijah Lofton going into year two, from guys like JoJo Trader going into year two, from a guy like Malachi Tony as an early enrollee freshman. What does it look like from these young cats as we put the pads on? That's probably where we're going to find out if it's real over the next couple of weeks. Now, I want to get into a few other kind of underlying storylines that I think are intriguing coming out of spring practice, most notably a little bit of a shakeup in the secondary from how this personnel is going to be used. Before we get into it, as always, the Miami fans, just want to say thank you to you guys. And it's been so fun talking this team during spring ball. And it's not like we have a ton to talk about, but whatever we can find to talk about, I'm certainly going to take that chance because it's been a blast talking this football team. obviously some very high expectations from me in terms of what this team can be in 2025. And the amount of support y'all have shown has been amazing. Appreciate you guys. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel. Without further ado, let's get into it. And I want to start with the secondary shakeup. This was a storyline for us coming into spring practice where Miami goes to the transfer portal and not only brings in one good cornerback, not only brings in two good cornerbacks, they really bring in four guys that can play for Miami in the 2025 year. And all of a sudden, the conversation is, how does it shake out? How do we get all these players on the football field? And that to me is a really big question when you try to evaluate a coaching staff. Yes, X's and O's matter. That we're not going to act like the X's and O's of football don't matter. But at the same time, to me, one of the best signs of an elite football coach is how do you get your best football players on the football field? And you look at the secondary and say, OJ Frederick and Xavier Lucas are probably your two best football players in the secondary. And what we've heard from Xavier Lucas during that first week of spring ball, it sounds like Miami has two guys going into their second year in OJ Frederick and Xavier Lucas who are legitimate first team all ACC caliber guys. Now, who's your third best guy in the secondary? And it's probably Zachariah Poyser at the secondary, at the safety spot. Who's your fourth best? It's probably Charles Brantley, right? And Charles Brantley, throughout his Michigan State career, has played 4 years, over 1,400 snaps, has played boundary cornerback. But then you look at Charles Brantley and say, all right, 6 foot, $180, probably best playing nickel. And he's never really played nickel. I went back and looked at it. He's played boundary cornerback his whole career at Michigan State. But if he's your fourth best player and you have an opening at the nickel spot potentially, can you maybe kick Charles into nickel? And that's it sounds like that's what we're hearing coming out of spring ball, is that it's kind of a blank slate. And you got a new coaching staff coming in that says, hey, we got a bunch of new players. We got a bunch of new coaching staffs. We're going to figure out how to get our best football players on the field. And you kind of assume that if you made a list of, all right, who are our top 5 players in the secondary for Miami going into 2025, Charles Brantley's one of them. And he's probably not going to play boundary cornerback because you got two studs in Xavier Lucas and OJ Frederick. How can we get him on the football field? Not only do I think Charles Brantley can play nickel, I think it might be his best position. Now, in Michigan State, he didn't play nickel because they needed him at boundary cornerback. He was their best boundary cornerback. At Miami, I think, they need him at nickel. And I think that could be his best position as a football player, too. And it sounds like Miami's staff is really going out of their way to find the best positions for these guys going into 2025. There seems to be much less of an emphasis on the X's and O's and much more of an emphasis on, hey, we know we have really good players. How do we get them on the football field? And how do we get them on the football field in their ideal positions? Because you're seeing the same thing at linebacker too. Wesley Bassane playing Mike linebacker, playing a little outside will linebacker, kind of moving around. This staff seems to be very intentional in terms of how we know we have the personnel to be a good defense. Now we are going to focus, instead of all this crazy scheme, we're going to focus on, hey, how can we get our best football players in the spots where they can be most successful? To me, I'm a huge fan of it. And you are starting to see that, especially in the back end of this Miami Hurricanes defense. The second big storyline coming out of the first week is these young playmakers on the offensive side of the football, starting with the wide receivers, because we know the run game is going to be really good. Are we good enough at wide receiver? You're hearing all the right things from both JoJo Trader and Malachi Tony. And we're trying to figure out, all right, we're going to run a lot of 11 personnel. We need 3 wide receivers on the football field. Who are going to be the 3 wide receivers that are starting for Miami? It sounds like, as we sit right now, CJ Daniels, JoJo Trader, and Malachi Tony. We've had a bunch of conversation regarding, does Miami need to go to the transfer portal to add another difference maker on the outside? I'm not necessarily in the camp that Miami shouldn't do that because it is a young, relatively unproven group. But as the days go on in spring practice, you start to feel a lot better about the guys that Miami has recruited at the high school ranks. JoJo Trader, Malachi Tony. We'll see how it shakes out when the pads come on, especially with some of these young guys, Malachi Tony, JoJo Trader. If we continue to hear the buzz that we hear around those players, Miami might not need to go to the transfer portal at the wide receiver position. And that's not to mention Elijah Lofton. And normally when we talk about playmakers around the quarterback, we just talk about wide receivers. I would be stunned if Elijah Lofton is not a top 3 pass catcher for this Miami Hurricanes team in the 2025 year. And to me, Elijah Lofton is much more than just a traditional tight end. And we don't see these kind of tight ends very often, right? A lot of tight ends just kind of serve a purpose. There are a couple of tight ends every year in college football that really emerge as central parts in a passing attack. Elijah Lofton can be that guy. You can put him in the backfield. You can put him in line. You can split him out wide. Again, the most underrated part about Elijah Lofton, nobody talks about it because he's not a huge tight end. He's an animal as a run blocker. And not just a capable run blocker. He graded out. This is not only just me watching. I look at PFF's grades. He is the number 1 run blocker on this football team as a true freshman, as a tight end. This is a guy that can get it done as a run blocker too. So I look at it and say it's not only about the wide receivers, it's about what you're hearing from a guy like Elijah Lofton too. I'm sitting here and saying, three weeks ago, before Miami kicked off spring practice, I was probably in the camp that Miami needs to go to the transfer portal and grab just one more veteran wide receiver. As spring practice has gone on, and if what we're hearing is true coming out of spring ball, maybe Miami doesn't need a playmaker on the outside, like I think a lot of us assumed going into spring practice. And once again, this is not me saying Miami should not do it, because again, it's a young and it's not an extremely deep room, but you're feeling better about that position than you did a couple of weeks ago. Last one, and this is a really big storyline. We've talked about it a little bit. The defensive line looks to be really deep. And that's really big, especially when you talk about Miami and their aspirations in the 2025 year. It's not to win 8 games. It's not to win 9 games. It's about winning 10 plus games, winning an ACC championship, being dangerous in the college football playoffs. We say this all the time. A lot of times what separates just those really good teams from the great teams that can be dangerous in December and January is the depth that you have. I think Notre Dame was a perfect example. Like what made Notre Dame so special, what allowed them to make a run to the national championship, they were a deep football team. They dealt with a lot of injuries, and which any team is gonna deal with injuries throughout a season. Do you have the depth to work through those injuries and continue to play football even when your team is banged up in the month of November, December, January? Especially along the lines of scrimmage, I think Miami has that. And a name that we don't really talk about because we feel like we know what we have is Ruben Bain. Keep an eye on him because he had a really good freshman year, one of the more dominant freshman years that I've seen in a while from a line of scrimmage player. Year two was not bad. Ruben Bain was not a bad football player, but it probably wasn't the jump that we all expected from Ruben Bain. And obviously injuries probably played a role in that. From what I've heard, he was playing banged up pretty much the majority of that season. Dropped a little bit of weight, lost 10 pounds in the offseason. I got no question mark about his play strength. He's been physically imposing his will on offensive linemen since his freshman year. Dropping 10 pounds, a healthy Ruben Bain as a pass rusher, that's what excites me the most. We know Ruben Bain's a great player. Can he be one of those players that, like what Abdul Carter did for Penn State or what Mason Graham did for Michigan? Can he be one of those players that can wreck games? Can he be a top 10 pick in the NFL draft? From what you're hearing about Ruben Bain dropping weight, getting healthy, that excites me. And then to kind of complement that, it's like Armando Blunt looks to be a guy going into 2025. Justin Scott looks to be a guy going into 2025. Artavius Jones, although dealing with an injury, there's a lot of buzz around him as well. It's a really talented unit. It sounds like it's going to be a really deep unit as well. That's another thing that is standing out to me coming out of spring ball. We got a lot of storylines, as the pads get out, especially with these line of scrimmage players, especially with these young football players. We're going to find out a little bit more. Fired up for the next couple of weeks. Also, what Miami's doing on the recruiting trail should not be ignored, and we're going to talk plenty about the recruiting trail as well. Appreciate you guys rocking with it. If y'all do enjoy the content, consider subscribing to the channel, and we'll talk to y'all later.